So one element you need to be aware of when you're sourcing and exporting products, especially out of China, is HTS codes, which then determine what tariff rate your product gets when it gets imported into the US or Europe. This is also really critically important for understanding your ROI and your cash flow position when you select certain products. So the purpose of this video is to understand the process for identifying the correct HTS or HS code internationally and the tariff rate for your potential product. So one of the things, whether you like them or hate them, don't really care, this isn't a political course at all, was there was a big impact a couple years ago when the Trump tariffs came into effect. This is effectively a maneuver with international trade between the US and China to add some fairly punitive tariffs to goods that originated from China coming into the United States specifically. In most cases, it would be about a 15 to 25% tariff. So let's say that your product costs $100, you're paying $15 to $25 just on that commercial invoice value to get it into the United States. So that basically caused a ripple. Historically, tariffs were usually like 2 to 5% for most products, but that all really changed here over the last, 4 years during the Trump tariff that came into effect. The other thing that's happened, I would say, over the last 5 or so years, it's always been a law within the United States trade rules, but it's something called anti-dumping. And this is basically a super punitive tariff that is applied to goods where the US government believes that there's unfair trade practices taking place. So I'll use a couple examples. Actually, the Canadian lumber industry got hit by this because the Canadian government was subsidizing the lumber industry in Canada. So the US put a really punitive tariff on Canadian lumber. So that's like a domestic example. But in China, there was a couple big ones. I think it was one of the big mattress companies here in the US basically put something in the mattress industry in China. So basically now, if you want to import a mattress from China, which isn't going to be easy given the size of the things right now, I think it's something like a 200 or 300% tariff because it was determined that the mattress and even some small furniture industries had anti-dumping practices. And then the solar industry was another one. So the Chinese government put a lot of investment into green energy and put a lot of investment to subsidize factories to make solar panels. So any solar panels that came from China into the US had a 200+% tariff. So the real food for thought here is that if you've got an HTS code that correlates to anti-dumping, it's probably a no-fly zone to originate that product from the country where those anti-dumping tariffs are being applied, which is usually China. So with those red flags out of the way, a couple other things is tariffs are based on where the country of origin is for that particular product. And country of origin is determined by where there's substantial transformation that's taken place. So it's not always where most of the product was made. Sometimes where it saw substantial transformation may not have been in the country where a lot of it was made. So I'll give you an example. Let's say that you had most of a product being made in China, and then you ship that product to Mexico, and the fundamental function of that product was actually finished and completed in Mexico. It's possible that the country of origin could be Mexico, even if some or most of the product components actually originated from outside of Mexico. So just realize that the tariff is going to be based on the country of origin, and the country of origin is based on where it was substantially transformed. For most of us, that's just going to be China, right? We're not going to get into too many complex supply chain scenarios, but I just wanted that to be clear that tariffs are based on where the product originates from a manufacturing standpoint. So what we basically want to find out is, where was it made and substantially transformed? In our case, our factories are typically going to be China. Then we want to determine what is the most relevant HTS code for the category if we're importing into the United States. If we're going international, it's going to be HS code, which is very similar to HTS code. And then we're also going to ask the question of, hey, is this really the right code, or is there a way for us to optimize this, legally optimize this, such that we're not paying such a punitive tariff rate? Especially if that tariff rate is like 25%, we may kind of try to see if there's alternatives. And I should also mention that if the product is less than $800 or the shipment is less than $800 in commercial value, there's zero duty. So if you're shipping samples or you're shipping a small batch that's less than $800, there's not going to be duty on that. So you don't need to worry about this stuff when you're kind of doing sample activities. Couple warnings too, I should say. Number one, if you adjust your HTS code from what it was originally when you started importing the product to later on, that can be a major red flag for customs, and they may actually flag your product for inspection when they see that. So if they see in their records, hey, these guys have actually changed their HTS code, especially if they changed it to a code that has a lower tariff rate, there's a high degree of possibility that they're going to pull it. So just be aware that you really kind of want to be thoughtful about this up front when you're creating a product, and you want to not change it a whole lot unless it really, really matters and you really can stand behind it legally. So you want to make sure that you're aware of that risk. The second is that there's some major fines for underreporting commercial value. And these can be retroactive to years back, and it can also be criminal, especially if you're based in the US. So I think a common practice, at least in the Amazon space, especially with a lot of foreign sellers, frankly, is let's say that I'm importing product that's $10,000, right? That was my factory cost on the product. They make the commercial invoice that they submit to customs $5,000. So they've effectively cut their tariff bill in half. The problem is that if that is ever caught and they pull bank records and they saw what you actually paid, there's a lot of ways that they can actually find out. That's a very, very serious legal matter. At a minimum, you're paying a whackload of fines, but there's also some criminal liability as well. So just be aware that this stuff it's not just fun and games, right? There's some serious consequences if you are nefarious with how you approach this and illegal of how you approach this. Then the final thing I should just note is that if you're doing any shenanigans or shortcuts to get a tweaked HTS code, or you're doing something with your commercial invoice value and you're comfortable with that risk, I'm not your dad, you do what you feel like you're comfortable doing, that's absolutely going to impact your exit value. I can speak from experience that when I sold my brand, one of the things that they looked at extensively was what was the HTS code for all the various products that were imported, and they pulled every single commercial invoice that was imported and they matched that up against the COGS that came out of the bank account. So if you're undervaluing commercial invoices to save money on tariffs and you think that that's your EBITDA, if the person buying you and your company finds out, they're going to factor that into their calculation, and it's probably going to impact how much they pay for your business, and it might be a red flag for them to even purchase it at all. So heed these warnings, be thoughtful about this stuff because it's pretty serious stuff. So the first stage that I recommend to identify an HS or HTS code, and frankly the one that I use 99% of the time, is you message your freight forwarder to get an estimated HTS code from them once you describe the product. And then they can also typically provide alternative or optimal options. So they might say, hey, Adam, we pulled your Golf push cart. Here's what we think the HTS code is, like letter of the law. The tariff is 18% on this one. However, you could argue that this HTS code could also be it, and that's 15%. Which one do you feel comfortable using? That's a typical scenario. So in my case, again, I use Forwarder 1 a lot, and we'll reference them a lot throughout this course. I basically just ping Kent, I think is the main contact over there. I'd be like, hey, Kent, I'm looking at this product. Can you let me know what you think the HTS code is? He gives me some options. We kind of have a dialogue about it and choose from there. That's going to be what most folks should do. So to become a freight forwarder, they all have to take courses on how to apply HTS codes. They're way more knowledgeable about this stuff than the layman, so I tend to defer to them on that. Another stage or option is really to evaluate your own options. So if you go to hts.usitc.gov, that's going to give a full list in the United States, at least, of all the HTS codes. So you can type in your product, and based on that search, it's going to give you some options on what the HTS code might be. Honestly and truly, through my career, I've imported a lot of stuff and hundreds of products. I had people on my team that used to do it for me, so I never had to do this stuff. So I don't really feel comfortable, honestly, walking through an example on how you can look at it. Like, that's over my head, frankly. It's out of my skill set. So I'm going to take a knee on actually how you do this. I'm sure there's YouTube videos if you kind of want to watch it. My recommendation is, unless you feel really, really comfortable and you study up on this stuff, and you find it fascinating and you want to do it on your own, go with that stage 1 option where you basically just work with your freight forwarder because they're really the experts in the space and can give you all the options. Another option, which I think is also definitely in the cards, especially if you've got a really kind of big product you're pursuing, right? So you think it's going to be a really high value. You might be placing an order for north of $20,000. You can actually hire an HTS consultant. This is John B. from Fiverr. He works for a freight forwarder, and you can hire him. He's $200 an hour, but I think for most he's $50 per HTS code lookup. So if you want to cross-reference from your freight forwarder, or you just want to go to him directly because you feel like it's a high stakes, high value product that you don't want to screw up and you want to get it right, you can hire John here. I would also just say too, if you've got really a high tariff amount that you want to try to see if there's any options and you're not quite sure if your freight forwarder is giving you all of them, John might be able to give you some alternatives too. Like, hey man, is there a way for us to find a legitimate legal classification for this product that's not 25% tariff? And he can work that angle for you and let you know if that's possible. Again, he's an expert. It's worth $50 for sure, given all the money on the line. Now, the other kind of ultimate stage on this is if you're not sure or you want to kind of pursue a more aggressive option that's a lower tariff amount, you could actually pursue a binding ruling request with the US government. And it's I think it's typically about a 4-week process. I think with COVID and stuff, they might have seen significant delays just because supply chains across the board and government agencies across the board seem to be delayed. But it was usually about a 4-week process. You submit a form, you describe the actual product, you show photos of the product, there's a description, all that fun stuff. And then you say, hey, we believe it's this HTS code. Can you conduct a binding ruling for me? Sometimes you need to ship that product in as well. To Customs Review, but this is a full-on legal stamp of approval. So once you get a binding ruling, it's permanent and it's done, and you don't have to really worry about it again. That said, if they do a binding ruling against what you think it is, there's really no turning back. You're gonna have to use whatever they think it actually is, and that's gonna be formally in the books for any import records that come through. I should also say this too. I've done some of this tariff optimization stuff before in my career. And one time we made a kind of a strategic move that was legal to adjust it to an HTS code that was less punitive and kind of got a lower duty rate. And then a year later, Trump tariffs came out and we ended up having to pay more, whereas the one it was on originally wouldn't have gotten that. So it's a little bit of a whack-a-mole exercise. You can determine how much it's worth for your particular product and situation, but there's definitely some creative outlets here to navigate to optimize for your tariffs. So, some other optimizations just to be aware of. One, you can remove non-product charges from your commercial invoices when you're getting imported. So, let's say that you had a $10,000 mold when you launched a product. You paid for $2,000 of it up front, and then the factory is going to add $5 to the product in perpetuity until that remaining $8,000 is paid off. That's a very likely scenario, especially as we like to structure some of our negotiations. You can ask your factory to bill you separately for that $5 unit charge because you don't want to get tariffs on that. So let's say that you had an additional $5, you pulled that out because you wanted it to be invoiced actually as a mold and not for the actual commercial invoice. That $5 times, say, a 20%, $5 times a 20% tariff amount is $1 saved. The other thing you definitely don't want included in here is any like engineering fees, anything like that that's non-product related. You should try to have that billed out separately so you don't get tariffed on that product and commercial invoice when it gets imported. The other thing is there's a substantial transformation strategy. Again, I don't think that 99% of the folks listening to this course are necessarily going to pursue this. But if you're importing millions of dollars worth of product a year, sometimes it may be worth looking at this as an option. And I've looked at this before on a product that we were importing $40 million a year. And the concept that we had was to basically make a lot of it in China, have it shipped to Mexico or Vietnam or Philippines or some country that doesn't have the punitive China tariffs, and do some of the substantial transformation that made the product function as it should in that final country, and then that final country has less tariffs. So you can look at that kind of approach I think if you've got a more sophisticated infrastructure and if you've got a really high spend on an item that's really punitive, and if you're going to save $1 million by pursuing it, it may be worth it for you. And in that case, I think similar trade win can be hired. I think that they can do an analysis and do a filing for about $5,000. So if you're ever looking at more sophisticated strategies like that, trade win's a good outlet, but substantial transformation kind of optimization is one strategy you can use. And then I should also just note that there's exclusion requests that you can also pursue. So let's say that you don't think that the tariff should apply to your product because it's for charity or it's for medical professionals, or there's some reason, compelling economic reason or social reason why you don't think that you should get a tariff. You can actually apply for exclusions to tariffs through the USTR. The other thing that's really cool about exclusions is that if one of your competitors in a particular category was granted an exclusion and it was broad enough such that it also describes your product, you can actually ride the coattails of that exclusion and avoid duties yourself. So I think it's definitely worth a little bit of research on the USTR.gov for your particular product. And you can just see, hey, has anybody been granted an exclusion from, say, a 301 duty or a Trump tariff or whatever the case is? And if it has, and it describes our product too, we could reference that legally when we import product to avoid duties. Again, this is a little bit more sophisticated, so I think somebody like a trade one is probably worth bringing in for that. But at a minimum, I definitely suggest folks go to USTR and just see if there's any exclusions that have been granted over the last couple of years for one of their competitors or somebody else in the space. And if you feel like there's a compelling reason for you to get an exclusion, you can also submit your own. But there's typically going to be some legal filing stuff for that. And then I should also just say that there's alternate sourcing strategies too. So if you find an HTS code from, say, China, and the tariff just is going to totally bust the product up, but you feel like you can have it manufactured in a non-China country, maybe Vietnam, maybe Thailand, maybe Pakistan, maybe Mexico, who knows, maybe even find a US-based one. But you can also look at alternative sourcing to avoid tariffs as well. And then the final point I'll just say is that duty drawback can also be a nice way to get some money back. So let's say that you've imported $20,000 worth of product from China to the US and you paid a 20% tariff on that $20,000 worth of product when it entered the US. So you basically had a $4,000 bill on tariffs you had to pay. Now let's say that you put that went to your 3PL and then you actually shipped some of your product or half of your product up to Canada for Canada FBA. Let's say that you shipped, half of your units. You could actually file to have $2,000 or half of that duty actually refunded via a duty drawback. So anytime you've paid taxes for product that came into the US and then you ship it to Canada, to Europe, to somewhere else, you can actually apply to get that money back because it wasn't commercially sold in the United States. So there's something that's called the ACE portal. So if you go to ace.cbp.dhf.gov, you can kind of see what that's all about. Again, you may want to hire some professionals on this. There's some people that do it pretty inexpensively, but definitely look at that, especially if you're doing a significant number of exports from the United States to countries, so you can get those duties back that you paid originally. So that is the fun stuff. Burn some brain cells on cool HTS codes and tariffs. I know it's the funnest thing that we all wanted to do when we decided to sell on Amazon. But it's important stuff, and if you're smart about it and you're operationally sophisticated about it, you can save a significant amount of money. I've saved millions of dollars with some of these optimizations and strategies in my career. Hope it was helpful. That's it for tariffs.